The story opens with the U.S. National Security Agency facing a growing nightmare. A ruthless hacker collective known as Anarchy 99, led by the elusive Georgy Petrov and his brutal enforcer Kala Rudberg, is wreaking havoc across Eastern Europe. Their cyber attacks have destabilized governments, cost countless lives, and pushed global security agencies to the brink. After losing agent after agent trying to stop them through conventional means, the NSA decides to change the game. Instead of trained operatives, they plan to weaponize chaos itself by recruiting people who live outside the rules. That's where Xander Cage comes in. Covered in tattoos and fueled by adrenaline, Xander is an extreme sports junkie and underground stunt performer based in the U.S. He survives off his wild talents, rejecting authority, responsibility, and anything resembling a normal life. His days are spent partying hard, driving dangerously fast cars, pulling off viral stunts, and dodging taxes like it's a sport. One night, a corrupt state senator sneaks off to a hotel for a secret rendezvous, completely unaware that Xander is watching. Disguised as a valet, Xander steals the senator's luxury car and blasts off at full speed. The senator immediately alerts the police, but it's already too late. By the time law enforcement catches on, Xander has turned the stolen car into a live-streaming stage, broadcasting the entire joyride to his followers. As the police chase him, Xander casually explains his motive to the audience. Apparently, the senator had publicly claimed that Drake was superior to Kendrick Lamar, and worse, had proposed legislation to block the release of GTA 6. For Xander, that was unforgivable. He decides to make an example out of the man. Reaching a massive suspended bridge, Xander does the unthinkable. He launches the car straight off the edge, ejects at the last second, and deploys a parachute. The vehicle explodes below, while Xander glides safely to the ground, where his friends are already waiting with a getaway car. The police are left frozen, trying to comprehend what they've just witnessed. That night, Xander returns to his hideout, where his crew throws him a wild celebration in honor of the stunt. During the party, his personal assistant, a sharp, blonde woman who manages his chaos, confesses that the heat is getting too intense. She urges him to disappear for a while until things cool down. Xander brushes it off, convinced he's untouchable. Moments later, armed military forces storm the building. Panic erupts as everyone scatters. Xander doesn't make it out. He's captured, injected with a tranquilizer-like round, and knocked unconscious. When he wakes up, Xander finds himself sitting in a quiet roadside diner. Confused, he asks the waitress how he got there. She nervously explains that some military men dropped him off. As Xander looks around, he notices several suspicious figures pretending to be ordinary customers. The waitresses shaking hands confirm his suspicion. Something isn't right. Suddenly, two men attempt to rob the diner. Xander effortlessly takes them down, drawing the attention of a calm, older man who introduces himself as Gibbons, a national security official. Gibbons praises Xander's instincts, but before he can continue, Xander calls him out. He points out every flaw in the setup: the fake patrons, the forced robbery, the terrified waitress, proving the entire scene was staged. Impressed, Gibbons reveals that Xander passed the test. Without asking for permission, he orders the waitress to shoot Xander again with the tranquilizer round. Xander wakes up restrained inside a military cargo plane, surrounded by silent, heavily armed soldiers. Before he can demand answers, the rear hatch opens mid-flight, and the roar of the wind fills the cabin. Two unfamiliar men beside him begin to panic. Seconds later, all three are shoved out of the aircraft with parachutes strapped on. They crash land in a dense jungle. Heat, terrain, and passing locals eventually reveal they're somewhere in Colombia. Before they can regroup, armed militants roll in with trucks and weapons. The two other men panic and flee, but Xander stays behind, assuming this is just another elaborate test. Arrogant as ever, he mocks the militants, claims diplomatic immunity, and insults their organization. That confidence vanishes instantly when one of them smashes him in the face with a rifle, but knocking him unconscious. Xander wakes up tied inside a grimy shack, surrounded by bricks of processed cocaine. The two men who tried to escape are tied up beside him. It's clear they've stumbled into a drug processing operation. The militant leader storms in, demanding answers. Still convinced it's all part of the recruitment process, Xander fires off jokes and insults, ridiculing the man's accent and style. The leader's patience snaps. He raises a machete, ready to make an example of Xander. Only then does Xander realize this isn't a test. Acting fast, he kicks the leader toward the others, breaks free from his restraints, and fights back, ultimately killing him. Just as the chaos peaks, helicopters thunder overhead. Colombian army forces arrive and unleash heavy gunfire on the compound, turning the operation into an all-out war zone. Gunfire tears through the drug facility as Colombian army helicopters rain bullets from above. Chaos erupts instantly. Everyone dives for cover while explosions and shrapnel rip through the structure. Xander wastes no time cutting the restraints off the two prisoners trapped beside him. As they attempt to flee, one of the men is struck by a stray round and collapses, unable to move. While Xander struggles to drag the injured man towards safety, the second prisoner panics, grabs a bag of crack, and abandons them without looking back. Xander manages to hide the wounded man in a patch of dense bushes before running back to find a way out. He spots a motorcycle and hops on, but almost immediately draws the attention of the army, who redirect their fire toward him. Forced into a desperate escape, Xander pulls off a series of reckless stunts, straight out of a high-speed action flick, dodging gunfire and losing his pursuers long enough to stash the bike. However, when he returns to retrieve the injured man, soldiers ambush him before he can react. By morning, Xander wakes up restrained once again. This time, Gibbons steps into view and calmly explains that the entire nightmare was yet another test. Furious, Xander lashes out, accusing Gibbons of playing games with real lives. Gibbons ignores the outburst and instead makes his offer clear. Rather than punish him, he wants to hire him. Xander refuses, until Gibbons casually lists every crime he's ever committed, making it painfully clear that walking away isn't an option. Cornered, Xander reluctantly accepts the assignment. Soon after, he's flown to Prague, where his mission is simple but dangerous. Infiltrate Georgy Petrov's inner circle by gaining his trust. Upon arrival, Xander is met by Milan Sova, a rigid secret police officer assigned to oversee him. Sova attempts to assert control, but Xander refuses to be intimidated, setting the tone for their strained partnership. That evening, Sova takes Xander to a high-end nightclub and introduces him to Petra. Sensing an opportunity, Xander makes his move, but is blocked by Petrov's men. Thinking quickly, he flips the situation by exposing Sova as a cop right in front of Petrov. Intrigued, Petrov orders his men to search Sova, and they quickly uncover his badge. Sova is thrown out, humiliated, while Xander earns Petrov's attention. When Xander introduces himself, Petrov's brother recognizes him from his viral stunt streams. Using that fame to his advantage, Xander casually asks about purchasing one of their cars. Negotiations are handled by Yelena, Petrov's sharp and composed assistant, and they eventually agree on the sale of a rare Ferrari. The night ends in heavy partying, cementing Xander's place among them. Later, Xander reports everything he's learned to Gibbons and requests extraction, but Gibbons orders him to stay embedded and dig deeper. Now forced to cooperate with Czech authorities, Xander heads to the police station where he meets Agent Toby, another American operative on the case. Toby welcomes him and equips him with a custom-built firearm loaded with specialty ammunition, including tranquilizer rounds identical to the ones used on him earlier. Toby also hands over advanced binoculars capable of seeing through solid objects, which Xander immediately uses to scope nearby activity. To top it off, he's given explosive bandages powerful enough to tear through reinforced walls. The following day, after Petrov confirms Xander's payment for the Ferrari, the two take the car out for a drive. Meanwhile, Sova attempts to spy on them, but accidentally gives himself away by breaking glass. Initially suspicious of Xander, Petrov quickly realizes neither of them caused the noise, prompting a hunt for the intruder. When Sova is discovered, Xander shoots him with tranquilizer rounds, sealing Petrov's trust. Impressed, Petrov officially welcomes Xander into the gang and invites him out with the crew that night. At the club, Xander tries to charm Yelena, but struggles to break through her cool demeanor. After repeatedly pushing for her attention, she allows a brief kiss, then abruptly leaves him, standing alone. Later, Xander is brought to the gang's mansion, where Yelena shows him to his room before disappearing again. Inside, he finds a woman arranged as a gift from the gang. Without hesitation, Xander indulges. The next morning, while sneaking around the mansion, Xander stumbles upon Yelena photographing hidden tech devices in the control room. When confronted, she tries to deflect, but Xander corners her with what he's seen. He blackmails her into having dinner with him, using the opportunity to reveal the tranquilizer bullets and hint at his true intentions. Xander finally tells Yelena the truth. He isn't who she thinks he is. He claims to be an undercover NSA operative. At first, she laughs it off, assuming it's another one of his mind games. But moments later, she receives a frantic call from one of Petrov's men, warning her that Xander's cover has been exposed. That's when reality hits. He wasn't bluffing. Unbeknownst to them, a sniper has already taken position in a nearby building, lining up a clean shot for when Xander exits the restaurant. Yelena urges him to leave through the back door, but Xander realizes that doing so would instantly expose her as the leak. Instead, he improvises. He starts a loud argument with Yelena, making it look like their fallout is genuine. Then he storms out through the front, deliberately drawing attention to himself. Gunfire erupts as the sniper takes a shot. Xander ducks, weaves through traffic, and narrowly escapes the line of fire. Just as he reaches his car, two men grab him and force him into a vehicle, delivering him straight to Gibbons. With no patience for explanations, Gibbons orders Xander to abort the mission immediately and return home. His cover is burned. Xander protests, but Gibbons won't budge. That same night, Xander disobeys orders. He sneaks back into Petrov's mansion, silently neutralizing guards along the way. While rigging the compound's vehicles and bikes with explosive bandages, he notices Petrov escort Yelena into a hidden underground passage. Curious, Xander follows. The passage leads to a concealed facility beneath the mansion, an abandoned Chernobyl site. Using his enhanced binoculars, Xander secretly observes everything. There, he uncovers Anarchy 99's true plan. They intend to deploy an electromagnetic pulse weapon known as the Dirty Bomb, using it to cripple global infrastructure and extort governments into chaos-driven submission. Once the Russian scientists complete their work, Petrov locks them inside the lab and releases a lethal gas, killing them without hesitation. Yelena watches in horror, powerless to stop it. With all the evidence he needs, Xander attempts to slip away, but he's spotted. Guards rush in, forcing him to fight his way out. He takes down several men and escapes the compound just as his planted explosives detonate, wiping out his pursuers. Back at his hideout, Xander runs into Sova, who is still furious over being exposed and shot. Enraged, Sova tries to kill him, but Yelena arrives just in time and kills Sova instead. Finally, she reveals the truth. She's been an undercover operative herself, embedded with Petrov for 2 years. Her agency abandoned her after repeated failures, leaving her trapped. Watching Xander in action reminded her why she became an agent in the first place. Xander sends all the gathered evidence to Gibbons, along with Yelena's testimony. Still, Gibbons orders him to return home. Xander refuses. He won't leave Yelena behind. He promises to help her bring Petrov down, no matter the risk. Moved by his resolve, Yelena finally lets her guard down and chooses to trust him completely. The next morning, Xander sends Yelena back to Petrov to avoid raising suspicion. Meanwhile, he reunites with Toby and the Czech police to plan a direct assault. Acting alone, Xander infiltrates one of Petrov's northern bases and triggers an avalanche, wiping it off the map. Unfortunately, reinforcements capture him and drag him back to Petrov's mansion. Petrov reveals the truth. He knew about Yelena all along. He had been manipulating her, using her loyalty against her. He admits he had grown to like Xander and is disappointed by his betrayal. Petrov rants about reshaping the world through fear and disorder before attempting to execute the agents. Before he can pull the trigger, police forces storm the mansion in a full-scale assault. In the chaos, Xander and Yelena break free, grab weapons, and pursue Petrov, who has already launched the dirty bomb. After an intense struggle, Xander finally kills Petrov, but it's too late. The weapon is active and moving. As the bomb glides across the water, Toby reveals that he secretly upgraded Xander's car with experimental features. Without hesitation, Xander and Yelena jump in and give chase. When roadblocks appear, Xander activates a built-in rocket launcher, blasting their way through. Realizing there's no other option, Xander hands control of the car to Yelena. He finds a grappling system on board and jokes about wishing he had a camera for the stunt he's about to attempt. He ejects the roof, fires the grappling hook, and launches himself onto the bomb mid-motion. Standing atop the device, Xander realizes the harsh truth. He has no idea how to disarm it. Gibbons arrives on site and orders jets to destroy the bomb, but immediately calls off the strike when he spots Xander riding it. With no solution left, Xander redirects the bomb into deep water moments before it detonates, disappearing in the blast. Believing him dead, the agents begin to mourn, until Xander emerges from the water, completely unfazed, earning reactions worthy of a superhero comeback. Weeks later, while Xander relaxes on vacation in Miami with Yelena, Gibbons contacts him once again. He congratulates Xander for passing, revealing that, just like before, the entire ordeal had been one final test. Analysis. What if I told you there was a time when action movies stopped wearing suits and started breaking bones, jumping off cliffs, and spitting in the face of authority? The early 2000s were loud, fast, reckless, and right in the middle of that chaos came a movie that didn't just break the spy movie rulebook, it burned it. XXX wasn't about martinis or manners. It wasn't about clean-cut heroes or polite patriotism. This was a film that asked a dangerous question. What if the world's deadliest missions were handled not by trained agents, but by the people society can't control? Enter Xander Cage, not a spy, not a soldier, but a walking act of rebellion. A man who doesn't follow orders. A man who treats danger like a playground. And a man who proves that sometimes chaos is exactly what the system needs. This movie didn't just sell action, it sold attitude. Extreme sports instead of gadgets. Street energy instead of elegance. And a hero who doesn't save the world because he's loyal, but because he refuses to be owned. In this video, we're diving deep into XXX, why it hit so hard in 2002, why it still stands out today, and how it redefined what an action hero could look like. So buckle up, because this isn't a spy story. It's a declaration of war against tradition. Let's get into it. Released in 2002, XXX arrived at a moment when action cinema was craving reinvention. Audiences had seen polished spies, calculated missions, and carefully choreographed heroics. This film chose a different lane, louder, rougher, and unapologetically extreme. At its core, XXX is an action spy thriller, but it wears that label loosely. Instead of suits and secret briefings, the movie drops us into a world of underground culture, high-risk stunts, and raw adrenaline. The story moves across international locations, giving it a global scale, but the energy always feels street-level and dangerous. The premise is simple, but bold. When a deadly threat emerges, one that traditional agents can't survive, the government turns to an unconventional solution. They recruit outsiders, rule breakers, people who thrive in chaos. That's where Xander Cage comes in. He isn't trained to blend in. He's trained to stand out. Without giving anything away, this movie sets up a clash between order and rebellion, between rigid systems and untamed instinct. What follows is a high-speed ride packed with stunts, explosions, and a hero who refuses to play by the book. If you're expecting subtle espionage, this isn't that movie. But if you want energy, attitude, and action that never lets up, XXX knows exactly what it's doing. And this is just the beginning. XXX may be marketed as a spy movie, but don't be fooled. This film rewires the genre from the inside out. At its foundation, XXX is an action film, loud and relentless. But layered on top of that is espionage, extreme sports, and counterculture energy that feels more punk rock than protocol. Where traditional spy movies value control, precision, and secrecy, XXX thrives on chaos, visibility, and raw instinct. The central theme here is rebellion. Not rebellion for the sake of noise, but rebellion against systems that believe obedience equals effectiveness. Xander Cage represents a new kind of hero, someone who doesn't respect authority just because it exists. Another key theme is identity. Xander is forced into a world that wants to reshape him, train him, and weaponize him. The tension comes from whether he'll lose himself or force the system to adapt to him instead. Emotionally, the movie is aggressive, confident, and intentionally unapologetic. There's no quiet introspection here. The tone is bold, masculine, and adrenaline-fueled, designed to make the audience feel like they're moving at full speed the entire time. This film is aimed at viewers who want energy over elegance, attitude over subtlety. If you enjoy rule-breaking heroes, high-risk stunts, and stories where instinct beats instruction, XXX speaks your language. It's not trying to be refined. It's trying to be unforgettable. And that choice defines everything that follows. The story of XXX begins far from secret headquarters or classified briefings. It starts in the underground, with Xander Cage, a thrill-seeker who lives for danger and has zero respect for authority. He's famous for pulling off illegal stunts, mocking the system, and surviving risks that would kill most people. That attitude makes him a problem for the government, and also the perfect solution. When an extremist group rises with a plan too lethal for traditional agents to handle, the intelligence community realizes something uncomfortable. Their rules are getting people killed. So they launch an experimental program, one that recruits outsiders instead of trained operatives. Xander is captured, tested, and thrown into a world he never asked to join. He's given minimal training, basic tools, and a single expectation: survive long enough to complete the mission. But from the start, it's clear Xander doesn't follow plans. He reacts, adapts, and improvises. As he's sent deep into enemy territory, the mission escalates fast. What seems like a simple infiltration begins to reveal a much larger threat, one driven by ideology, revenge, and the desire to collapse systems of power. Every reckless decision Xander makes pushes the story forward, turning him from a disposable asset into a real force. The tension doesn't come from whether he can complete the mission, but whether the mission can survive him. Cause leads to consequence. Instinct leads to impact. And by the time the stakes are fully revealed, Xander Cage is no longer just part of the operation. He is the operation. B. Why the time XXX reaches its final act. One thing is crystal clear. Xander Cage was never meant to become a traditional agent. The climax brings every idea in the film crashing together. The mission is completed, the immediate threat is neutralized, and the system gets exactly what it wanted on paper: success. But the way that success is achieved is what matters most. Xander doesn't win by obeying orders. He doesn't win by trusting authority. He wins by trusting his instincts. The same instincts the system initially tried to control. On the surface, the ending wraps things up cleanly. The danger is gone, the world is safer, and the operation is technically a success. But beneath that resolution lies the movie's real message. Rigid systems need chaos to survive threats they can't understand. Symbolically, the ending represents freedom over ownership. Xander refuses to become a permanent weapon, a number in a database, or a replaceable tool. He chooses people over protocols, loyalty over labels. There's also an open-ended feeling baked into the finale. Not because the story is unfinished, but because the question remains: what happens when someone proves the rules were wrong all along? XXX doesn't end by crowning a hero of the system. It ends by validating the rebel who forced the system to adapt. And that choice is exactly why the ending still hits that on the surface, XXX looks like pure adrenaline, explosions, stunts, and nonstop momentum. But underneath all that noise, the film is quietly making a statement. Let's start with the most obvious symbol, the XXX mark itself. It's not just a tattoo or a branding gimmick. It represents being permanently labeled as an outsider, someone the system can use but never truly accept. Once you're marked, there's no going back. And Xander wears that mark proudly. The movie also takes subtle jabs at classic spy cinema. Notice how gadgets constantly fail or become irrelevant, while instinct and improvisation save the day. That's not accidental. It's the film openly mocking the idea that technology and training alone create heroes. Pay attention to the environments. Underground clubs, graffiti-covered streets, extreme landscapes. They mirror Xander's internal chaos. Every location reinforces that he doesn't belong in clean offices or controlled spaces. Even early scenes foreshadow this, showing how he refuses to follow instructions long before the mission begins. There's also quiet foreshadowing in how authority figures treat Xander. He's never fully trusted, only tolerated, a warning that once the mission ends, he'll be discarded. That tension runs silently through the film, making the ending feel earned. XXX doesn't shout its symbolism. It hides it between explosions. And once you notice it, the movie becomes a lot smarter than it first appears. Behind all the explosions and extreme stunts, XXX has a surprisingly interesting story off-screen. Vin Diesel wasn't just the face of Xander Cage. He helped shape the character. He pushed for Xander to feel authentic, not polished, making sure the role reflected real counterculture energy instead of a traditional action hero mold. That's why the character feels more like a lifestyle than a disguise. Many of the movie's most memorable action moments relied heavily on practical stunts, not digital shortcuts. Professional extreme sports athletes were brought in to make sure the movements looked real, risky, and raw. The goal wasn't perfection, it was believability at high speed. The film's soundtrack also played a major role. Instead of orchestral spy themes, XXX leaned into aggressive rock and electronic music to match its rebellious identity. The music wasn't just background noise, it helped define the movie's personality. There were also scenes and concepts trimmed during production to keep the pacing relentless. Anything that slowed the momentum was cut, reinforcing the idea that this movie was designed to move, not pause. XXX wasn't made to be subtle. It was engineered to hit hard, move fast, and leave a mark. And knowing how it was made only makes that impact clearer. To understand what XXX really is, you have to look at what it was pushing against. For decades, the spy genre was dominated by clean suits, calm voices, and controlled violence, most famously in the James Bond films. Those heroes survived through elegance and precision. XXX took one look at that formula and said, not anymore. Where Bond blends in, Xander Cage stands out. Where Bond follows protocol, Xander breaks it. And where traditional spies rely on gadgets, XXX relies on instinct and physical risk. It also shares DNA with early 2000s action hits like The Fast and the Furious, trading refinement for raw energy and speed. But unlike street racing films, XXX leans harder into global stakes and ideological conflict, keeping one foot firmly in espionage territory. What XXX does better than its rivals is momentum. It never slows down to over-explain itself. But that strength is also its weakness. Compared to more character-driven action films, it sacrifices depth for spectacle. And that's the key difference. XXX isn't trying to outthink the genre. It's trying to outrun it. Whether that works depends on what kind of action movie you came for. And that choice defines how you'll experience the film. When XXX hit theaters in 2002, the reaction was anything but quiet. Audiences showed up in force. The movie delivered exactly what it promised: speed, attitude, and spectacle, and that translated into strong box office performance. For many viewers, XXX felt fresh, rebellious, and perfectly tuned to the energy of the early 2000s. Critics, however, weren't as unified. Some appreciated the film's willingness to flip the spy genre on its head. Others saw it as shallow, loud, and more style than substance. The same things audiences loved, the excess, the bravado, the nonstop action, became the very reasons critics pushed back. And that's why XXX became divisive. Over time, though, something interesting happened. The movie didn't fade away. Instead, it gained a second life as a cult favorite, remembered less for its plot and more for its personality. In hindsight, many viewers now see it as a time capsule of its era, exaggerated, fearless, and unapologetically bold. So is XXX underrated or overrated? The answer depends on what you value. If you judge it by realism and depth, it falls short. If you judge it by impact and attitude, it absolutely delivers. And that tension is exactly why people are still talking about it.so. Where does XXX ultimately land? This is a movie powered by pure momentum. Its biggest strengths are impossible to ignore. Relentless energy, a charismatic lead, and action sequences that never pretend to be subtle. It knows exactly what it wants to be and never apologizes for it. But that confidence comes at a cost. Character depth is thin. The story exists mainly to connect set pieces. If you're looking for layered storytelling or emotional complexity, XXX won't give you much to hold on to. And that's okay, because it was never trying to. This film is for viewers who want speed over substance, attitude over elegance, and adrenaline over analysis. It's built for those nights when you don't want to think, you want to feel. If you enjoy rebellious anti-heroes, extreme stunts, and early 2000s action cinema at full volume, XXX delivers exactly what it promises. Final recommendation: not a timeless spy classic, but a bold, unapologetic action ride that still stands as one of the era's most recognizable adrenaline hits. And sometimes, that's more than enough. Reviews: Xander Cage, played by Vin Diesel, is introduced as a thrill-seeking rebel with a loud personality and zero interest in playing by the rules. He thrives on chaos, staging dangerous stunts purely for shock value and underground fame. This reckless lifestyle lands him in the hands of NSA agent Gibbons, Samuel L. Jackson, who sees Cage not as a liability, but as a useful tool. Xander is forced into a covert mission: infiltrate the criminal organization run by Yorgi, a European gangster with grand ambitions and a flair for menace. Cage fits in easily. He has the look, the attitude, and, most importantly, he's expendable. Yelena, portrayed by Argento, serves as Yorgi's enigmatic associate and eventual love interest. Much of the film feels like a stripped-down imitation of a James Bond adventure, only without the finesse. The plot twists itself into knots, clearly borrowing from classic spy formulas, but rarely adding anything new. Still, explosions are plentiful, and destruction is treated like a feature rather than a side effect. Vin Diesel carries the film with sheer presence. While his performance is minimal on an emotional level, his screen charisma is undeniable. He proves he can command an action role, even if he hasn't quite found the perfect franchise yet. Visually, the movie is flashy but hollow. Style often replaces substance. This seems to be a recurring signature of director Rob Cohen. The film leans heavily into over-the-top spectacle, often tipping into outright silliness. The exaggerated Euro-villain aesthetic doesn't always work, and much of the humor feels unintentionally dumb. Still, there's just enough entertaining chaos to make the movie passable as escapist fun. It's loud, brainless, and occasionally ridiculous, yet somehow manages to be mildly enjoyable in its own crude way. Essentially, this is Rob Cohen's version of a spy movie, done in the same spirit as his car racing films. Big, noisy, self-satisfied, and convinced it's cooler than it actually is. The movie opens on a promising note, throwing viewers into bizarre situations like stage robberies and introducing an intentionally abrasive lead character. Xander Cage is neither charming nor subtle, casually pulling off stunts like jumping out of a moving car mid-collapse. Once the story shifts to Prague, things follow a predictable downhill path. Cage joins the villains, falls for the girl, blows his cover, and then everyone starts shooting until the credits roll. From a technical standpoint, the film looks impressive. The locations are strong, and the budget is clearly visible in the special effects. However, while the action is constant, much of it lacks credibility. The movie tries to ground its stunts in realism, but that approach doesn't work when the sequences are already exaggerated beyond belief. There are some memorable moments. The dinner tray stunt and the exploding motorbike stand out, but most of the action feels forced rather than thrilling. Explosions, avalanches, and extreme sports sequences come and go without much impact. The cast has helped keep things interesting. Diesel's brutish persona is still entertaining enough to watch, even if only for his smug one-liners. Martin Chokas brings a certain charm to the villain role, and familiar faces like Danny Trejo and Samuel L. Jackson add energy through exaggerated versions of their usual characters. Asia Argento's presence is undeniably striking, and her raw, unapologetic portrayal gives the film some edge, even if her character exists more for style than depth. In the end, the movie isn't great, but it's not unbearable either. It's predictable, flawed, and often dumb, yet packed with enough visual noise to keep viewers engaged. When Rob Cohen and Vin Diesel reunited after Fast and Furious, the goal seemed to be reinventing the spy genre for a new era. Unfortunately, that ambition never fully materializes. The plot, centered on anarchists threatening global destruction through biological weapons, is pure Bond territory, but Diesel never convincingly sells himself as a master spy. The film runs longer than it should, the villains leave little impression, and the action choreography frequently disappoints. While the movie tries hard to modernize the spy mythos, it ultimately falls short. It's not a complete failure, but it's far from a success. Whatever it aimed to be, it never quite gets there. And that's the biggest problem of all. XXX is a very early 2000s American action movie, and looking back at it now, especially with later sequels existing, it feels like a time capsule that hasn't aged particularly well. This film was released in 2002, long before modern spy movies learned how to balance spectacle with coherence. Vin Diesel returns as the lead, working once again with director Rob Cohen, a pairing audiences already recognize from The Fast and the Furious. If you know that movie, you already have a decent idea of what kind of experience this one delivers. At its core, this is a loud, flashy, and ultimately hollow action film. The story follows an extreme sports celebrity who gets recruited by the government to carry out a dangerous undercover mission. On paper, that sounds exciting, but in execution, the plot feels thin and stretched far beyond what it can reasonably support. 2 hours is simply too long for a story with this little substance. Even Samuel L. Jackson, an actor I usually enjoy, can't elevate his role here. His character is bland, predictable, and mostly there to crack jokes and move the plot forward when necessary. Diesel's protagonist succeeds at everything with ease. Every mission goes exactly his way, even when the movie pretends otherwise. He completes tasks, delivers a smug one-liner, and walks away untouched again and again. It might feel entertaining the first couple of times, but it becomes repetitive very quickly. The film clearly wants him to be this effortlessly cool alpha figure, but instead he comes off as trying too hard. One sequence that briefly stood out takes place in a restaurant, where the female lead warns him that someone is targeting them. For once, there's a bit of tension, and Diesel's character has to think beyond brute force. Unfortunately, that moment is short-lived. What follows is just an endless chain of action scenes, including a snowy finale that adds nothing new. To make matters worse, some of the stunt editing, especially a motorcycle sequence, is so poorly handled that it's genuinely uncomfortable to watch. It's chaotic in the worst way, and all the supposedly cool spy tech introduced earlier is discarded by the end. The movie occasionally hints at wanting to be smarter than it is. There are moments meant to feel meaningful, like recognizing a character through her boots or having Jackson's character explain deeper motivations later on. But none of it lands. It feels forced, like the filmmakers wanted depth without really knowing how to achieve it. Add an awkward banter on a plane and forced rivalries, and the film leans hard into cliches instead of originality. There are obvious nods to James Bond throughout. Lines about serving one's country followed by a night with a beautiful woman, but these references feel shallow. They're played for cheap laughs rather than clever satire. The result is a movie that feels more like a parody without fully committing to being one. Despite my criticism, it's easy to see why the film found an audience at the time. It's aggressively 2000s, loaded with cameos from musicians, athletes, and pop culture figures, and drenched in rebellious attitude. The opening even mocks classic spy films by killing off a traditional agent early on, signaling that this is a louder, messier alternative. Still, style alone can't save it. The plot itself barely matters. Xander Cage infiltrates an Eastern European criminal group led by a villain named Yorgi, uncovering a threat that could endanger the world. But let's be honest, no one watches this movie for the story. You already know how it ends. The question is whether the journey is worth it, and for me, it isn't. In the end, this feels like a movie where even one installment might have been enough. The fact that it spawned sequels years later speaks more to audience nostalgia than quality. While some may enjoy it as a guilty pleasure or a snapshot of early 2000s excess, I can't recommend it. For me, this one earns a clear thumbs down. If you're going into this movie hoping for a storyline that keeps you guessing for more than half a minute, then you're probably in the wrong seat. The plot is incredibly predictable, often silly, and regularly abandons logic and common sense altogether. While the core idea works well enough for a switch-your-brain-off action flick, the sloppy writing undermines it at almost every turn. Take a few examples. Spoilers ahead. There's a scene where Xander snowboards down a mountain to assault a remote shack. Does he wear white camouflage to blend into the snow? Of course not. He's dressed head to toe in black. Later, a final chase involves a submarine leaving a fortress several minutes before Xander follows. When he finally catches up, he comments that the sub must be moving at around 80 miles per hour. Yet he somehow manages this feat while driving a car through winding rural roads. And let's not forget the submarine itself. It supposedly runs on solar power, yet launches at full capacity from an underground base. Even more confusing, why build a submarine in Prague, a country with no coastline, and then never even submerge it? Sure, you could argue that nitpicking details like these misses the point. If the movie were genuinely fun, most viewers would happily forgive nonsense. Unfortunately, that fun factor never fully arrives. Some action sequences are passable, but nothing stands out as memorable or inventive. Aside from its generous budget, the film feels little different from the kind of flashy but forgettable action movies that play on late-night television every weekend. The weak storyline is frustrating, but what really hurts is the lack of energy and excitement. Even in a packed theater, reactions were limited to the occasional chuckle, nothing that truly engaged the audience. As for the performances, opinions may vary, but I remain unconvinced about Vin Diesel as the so-called next great action hero. He certainly looks the part, cool, confident, and physically imposing, but comparing him to Bruce Willis feels like a stretch. His one-liners rarely land, and while he's effective in the opening scenes when playing things naturally, the persona quickly wears thin. Diesel handles the action competently, but his character relies more on muscle than personality. Where Willis balanced toughness with relatability, Diesel leans closer to the Arnold Schwarzenegger model. All brawn, limited depth. The supporting cast doesn't fare much better. Asia Argento is serviceable but unremarkable, while Martin Chokas fits perfectly into the familiar generic Eastern European villain mold. Samuel L. Jackson, unfortunately, feels completely disengaged, as if he's just going through the motions. This is especially disappointing considering his strong performance in Changing Lanes around the same time. Eve, despite her natural attitude and screen presence, is criminally underused. Her role barely registers as more than a cameo. The movie opens with the death of a tuxedo-clad secret agent, a clear signal that the classic Bond-style spy is outdated and that a new kind of hero has arrived. I'm not convinced. While this franchise might squeeze out a sequel, it lacks the charm, longevity, or cultural pull of Bond. Ironically, several of its biggest stunts feel lifted straight from Bond films anyway, the Stars and Stripes parachute being a prime example. On the technical side, the film delivers exactly what you'd expect. Loud explosions, flashy chases, extreme sports antics, and plenty of gunfire. Xander Cage is introduced as a rebellious adrenaline junkie forced into government service to avoid prison. Recruited by NSA agent Gibbons, he's sent undercover into Prague to infiltrate a radical organization led by a dangerous criminal threatening nuclear chaos. Armed with high-tech gadgets courtesy of a Q-like tech expert, Xander barrels through the mission with brute force and attitude. The soundtrack, packed with heavy rock and high-energy beats, helps maintain momentum, and the production values are undeniably polished. Directed by Rob Cohen, a familiar name in big-budget action cinema, the movie looks expensive, even if it doesn't always feel inspired. A sequel followed later, though it failed to recapture even this film's modest impact. In the end, the movie is mildly entertaining, but ultimately average. I wasn't expecting smart writing or a complex plot, but I did expect more excitement and personality. Younger audiences may enjoy the nonstop action, but even viewers with low expectations might question whether this is truly the secret agent of a new generation. Personally, it mostly left me counting the days until the next Bond film. The movie follows a muscle-bound rebel who spends most of his time breaking rules, pulling insane stunts, and eventually punching his way through enemies, while also getting romantically tangled with a mysterious Russian agent, Yelena. Honestly, there's nothing technically wrong with the film. It's entertaining, fast-paced, and fun in a very unrealistic way. That said, it's not something I'd put at the top of a must-watch list. And I can't help but wonder, will Vin Diesel ever fully step away from roles that exist mainly to show off his physical presence? To be fair, he has proven he can do more, like in Saving Private Ryan. A fun side note, Yelena is played by Asia Argento, whose father, Dario Argento, is a legendary name in horror cinema. I first watched this movie back in my late teens, and all I really remembered years later was the lead actor and the fact that it involved spies and extreme action. Revisiting it now, especially before diving into the sequels, felt logical. The film was directed by Rob Cohen, who's no stranger to big, loud action movies. The plot kicks off with a Russian extremist group called Anarchy 99 getting their hands on a dangerous biochemical weapon known as Silent Night, believed to have vanished after the collapse of the Soviet Union. An undercover NSA operative, Jim McGrath, is sent in to retrieve it, but is exposed and killed during a chaotic rock concert. This failure leads scarred NSA veteran Augustus Gibbons to pitch a risky idea. Recruit someone completely outside the system, someone reckless, fearless, and untraceable. Enter Xander Cage, an adrenaline junkie and outlaw whose idea of activism includes stealing a senator's prize Corvette and crashing it in protest of censorship laws. Xander's luck runs out when a SWAT team storms his hideout, knocking him out cold. He wakes up in what appears to be a normal diner, but small details feel off. A stage robbery confirms his suspicions, and Gibbons reveals himself. It was all a test, and Xander passed. Not impressed, Cage tries to walk away, only to be drugged again. He regains consciousness aboard a military cargo plane, alongside two other criminals, before they're dumped into the Colombian jungle. Captured by a violent drug cartel led by El Jeef, the men initially assume it's another setup, until torture proves otherwise. Xander breaks free, causes chaos, and escapes, only to be recaptured by camouflaged NSA agents. Once again, Gibbons appears, calmly explaining that dismantling the cartel was yet another test. This time, Xander is given a choice: accept a prison sentence or work undercover on an extremely dangerous mission. Reluctantly, he agrees and is officially branded as Agent XXX. His assignment takes him to Prague, where he's paired with an NSA support team and placed under the watchful eye of Agent Milan Sova. Xander infiltrates an elite Anarchy 99 gathering and comes face-to-face with their leader, Georgi, a bitter former soldier with a deep hatred for authority. As Xander embeds himself deeper into their world, he grows closer to Yelena, who appears to be Georgi's lover but clearly has her own secrets. Through daring moves and calculated risks, Xander gains Georgi's trust, even exposing Sova as a supposed traitor to solidify his cover. Armed with advanced gadgets, custom weapons, high-tech surveillance tools, and cleverly disguised explosives, he officially becomes part of Anarchy 99. But as the mission unfolds, loyalties blur. Sova betrays Xander for real, prompting Yorgi to order his execution. Thanks to a warning from Kirill, a sniper secretly in love with Yelena, Xander narrowly escapes death. He and Yelena fake a violent argument to slip away, but things spiral out of control. Xander is captured by the NSA, while Yelena is dragged back to the terrorist stronghold. Gibbons insists the mission is over and orders Xander home, but Xander refuses, knowing Yelena's life is at risk. Defying orders, he infiltrates Yorgi's castle alone, tracking him into a hidden underground lab, where the true scope of the biochemical threat is finally revealed. Xander Cage stumbles onto Yorgi's deadly plan after overhearing discussions about launching Silent Night, a biochemical weapon mounted on a water-based drone called Ahab. To prove its effectiveness, Yorgi coldly tests the device on the very scientists who created it, leaving Cage and Yelena horrified. Chaos erupts when Czech police storm the mansion, blowing it apart, though Yorgi and his right-hand man Kirill manage to flee. Xander and Yelena give chase, and Cage ultimately takes out Kirill with a heat-seeking rocket, while Kolya is believed to have been killed in the blast as well. Yelena later saves Xander's life and finally reveals the truth. She's an abandoned undercover agent from the Russian Federal Security Service. Cage reports Yorgi's plot to the NSA and agrees to stop the attack in exchange for Yelena being granted asylum. Armed with Shaver's high-tech upgrades, Xander launches into another outrageous mission, leaping from a plane on a snowboard near Anarchy 99's communications tower. He triggers an avalanche that wipes out the tower, but is captured by Yorgi, who already knows Yelena's real identity. Just as Yorgi prepares to execute them, special forces storm in. Xander and Yelena break free, but Yorgi manages to activate Ahab before Cage kills him. With the drone racing down the Vltava River toward the city, the Czech military plans an airstrike. Gibbons objects, knowing the explosion would spread the chemical agent. Instead, Xander and Yelena pursue the weapon in his heavily modified car. In classic over-the-top fashion, Cage harpoons the drone, boards it, and disables the weapon seconds before catastrophe. The pair survive, Gibbons keeps his word, and sometime later Xander and Yelena are seen relaxing in Bora Bora, until Gibbons calls with another mission, which Xander casually ignores. The supporting cast is stacked with memorable faces, including Jan Filipinski, Eve, Layla Arsiri, William Hope, and even cameo appearances from extreme sports legends like Tony Hawk and Matt Hoffman. Vin Diesel brings enough charisma to sell the adrenaline junkie-turned-agent role, while Samuel L. Jackson does a decent job as the no-nonsense authority figure. That said, the film clearly tries very hard to mimic the James Bond formula. Gadgets, exotic locations, a mad villain, a handler, and a glamorous ally, all of which makes the plot fairly predictable. Still, what the movie lacks in originality, it makes up for in energy. The chases, gunfights, and outrageous stunts are undeniably entertaining and often impressive. It's loud, fast, and unapologetically excessive. The film was even nominated for a Razzie for Most Flatulent Teen-Targeted Movie, which honestly feels fitting. I hadn't seen this film until recently, and when it popped up in the TV guide, it looked like the least terrible option available. I'm glad I gave it a shot. It turned out to be surprisingly fun. Sure, the story is very much discount Bond, and Vin Diesel isn't exactly known for subtle acting, but he delivers exactly what this kind of movie demands. The plot mainly exists to connect a series of jaw-dropping action sequences, parachuting from a car mid-bridge, motorcycle stunts under helicopter fire, and snowboarding straight into an avalanche. Toss in Bond-style gadgets like wall-piercing binoculars, multi-purpose weapons, and explosives disguised as bandages, and you know exactly what kind of ride you're signing up for. If you're looking for deep storytelling or sharp dialogue, this isn't it. But if you want a couple of hours of mindless fun packed with explosions, stunts, and unapologetic spectacle, it absolutely delivers. Xander Cage may never dethrone James Bond, but XXX ends up being more entertaining than some actual Bond films. No CGI surfing here, just dumb, loud, enjoyable action. Not a great movie, but as a tongue-in-cheek, over-the-top action fantasy, it worked for me. XXX throws its audience straight into excess. The film opens with a wild stunt involving the theft of a politician's prize Corvette, which ends with the car flying off a bridge while its driver parachutes to safety. That driver, Xander Cage, isn't rewarded for his recklessness. He's given an ultimatum: spend the rest of his life behind bars under a 3-strike sentence or work for the government. The offer is delivered by a no-nonsense handler played by Samuel L. Jackson, and from that moment, the movie fully commits to its overblown action fantasy. Cage is dropped into a hostile foreign city and tasked with infiltrating a Russian anarchist group planning to unleash a deadly chemical device capable of poisoning entire metropolitan areas. His cover story involves dealing in ultra-rare, high-end cars, including a muscle car from his own past. Naturally, the mission comes with a tech expert who outfits his vehicle with enough gadgets to make even a spy jealous. The plot escalates through increasingly ridiculous stunts until Cage saves the day, dismantles the weapon, and secures safe passage to the U.S. for a Russian agent who ends up on his side. What's surprising is that despite all this success, the film still manages to win some viewers over, myself included. Normally, hyper-stylized action movies filled with explosions, fast cars, and macho bravado are my thing. Yet there's something undeniably engaging here, possibly because of the aggressive metal aesthetic. Opening with a roaring Rammstein concert sets the tone perfectly, and casting Argento adds a certain edge that works in the film's favor. Vin Diesel fits comfortably into the role of the modern action hero. Like the muscle-bound stars before him, Schwarzenegger, Seagal, Van Damme, and later The Rock, he's built to project toughness while still remaining broadly likable. That said, movies like this are often done by design. The hero is always anti-authority, always breaking rules, and yet somehow ends up working for the government because official agents can't get the job done. It's nonsense, but it's entertaining nonsense. From a pure action standpoint, the movie mostly succeeds. The stunts are absurd, but carefully stopped just short of parody. If they went any further, they'd land squarely in Austin Powers territory. You can tell a lot of effort went into the practical effects and choreography, even if logic wasn't invited to the set. As long as you don't overthink it once the credits roll, the ride is fun enough. That said, the movie has plenty of flaws. The story doesn't flow smoothly, and the pacing suffers from unnecessary filler. Diesel occasionally pushes the performance too hard, and the dialogue is packed with painfully bad one-liners. The film also runs longer than it needs to, and by the end, the finale borders on accidental comedy. Much of XXX feels like a rough, aggressive remix of the James Bond formula: gadgets, handlers, villains, and globe-trotting danger, but stripped of elegance and replaced with brute force and attitude. There's an M, figure, a Q, type tech guy, and extravagant set pieces, just without the charm or sophistication of Connery or Brosnan. It's Bond for the extreme sports generation. I recently revisited the film on streaming, and while the concept itself is pretty ridiculous, it still has moments that work. Some action sequences are genuinely impressive. The soundtrack slaps hard, and a brief appearance by Danny Trejo delivers unexpected laughs. A few lines have even become oddly iconic over time. Unfortunately, character development, especially for Argento's role, doesn't really make sense, and the ending feels rushed and unsatisfying. In the end, XXX is loud, messy, and often stupid, but it does what it sets out to do. It entertains. And for a movie built on explosions, testosterone, and impossible stunts, that's really the only promise it needs to keep. This film is honestly a rough entry in the action genre, and feels like a studio product designed to cash in on the early 2000s obsession with extreme sports and the massive popularity of street racing blockbusters at the time. I recently revisited XXX 2002 on Tubi after many years, and the experience didn't improve with age. I'd personally give it a March 10th and suggest skipping it unless you're feeling nostalgic. The story centers on an outlaw extreme sports icon who gets forcibly recruited by the U.S. government to infiltrate an international crime syndicate and uncover their plans before things spiral out of control. The film is directed by Rob Cohen and stars Vin Diesel, alongside Samuel L. Jackson, Martin Chokas, Asia Argento, and Danny Trejo. The core idea behind the movie is weak, and many of the action sequences are pushed so far beyond reason that they become unintentionally absurd. That said, the film does feature some genuinely impressive stunts and visual effects, and the soundtrack delivers a strong dose of early 2000s adrenaline. Danny Trejo's brief appearance is easily one of the highlights. His delivery of Mr. Funny Guy never fails to get a laugh, and the infamous "bitches come" line has oddly become one of the movie's most memorable moments. Unfortunately, character development is practically non-existent. Asia Argento's character undergoes a transformation that feels unearned and inconsistent with her established background, and the dialogue is packed with cringeworthy one-liners that rarely land. The final act doesn't stick the landing either, making the ending feel rushed and unsatisfying. The premise itself is simple. Because he's such a wild, rule-breaking force, the U.S. government decides to put convicted adrenaline junkie Xander Cage on the payroll. After surviving a series of macho loyalty tests run by scar-faced agency handler Gibbons, Cage is sent to Prague to get close to anarchist leader Yorgi, a villain who somehow throws great parties while planning chaos. Yelena, Yorgi's mysterious partner, becomes both a romantic distraction and an intelligence asset. If your ideal movie night involves loud engines, explosions, and Vin Diesel covered in tattoos, this film delivers exactly that. No more, no less. Logic takes a back seat throughout. Subtlety is nowhere to be found, and the dialogue often feels like it could have been replaced with grunts without losing much meaning. The movie leans heavily into testosterone-fueled spectacle, action, a glamorous love interest, juvenile humor, and then even more action. Vin Diesel is clearly being positioned as a new generation action icon, though he's still largely limited to one-note characters with minimal emotional range. Financially, the formula worked. XXX and the Fast and the Furious both made serious money, but creative depth wasn't part of the deal. At times, the film feels like a mashup of a James Bond-style spy movie and an extreme sports showcase. The opening stunt, featuring a death-defying jump into an exploding warehouse, is easily the film's high point and arguably the only sequence truly worth the hype. Everything that follows struggles to match that level of spectacle. While director Rob Cohen manages to keep the pacing energetic, the cliché-ridden plot exists solely to string together action scenes. Shot largely in Prague with slick cinematography and backed by a pounding score, the movie looks polished but lacks substance. It wants to be stylish, rebellious, and dangerous, yet takes itself far too seriously to fully embrace the fun absurdity it flirts with. In the end, XXX feels like excess without purpose. If you're craving pure noise, speed, and chaos, you'll find it here. But if you're looking for engaging storytelling or memorable characters, there are far better ways to spend your time. Personally, I'd recommend finding something more rewarding to watch. The premise is simple enough. The Secret Service is running out of agents reckless enough to survive the kind of missions no sane professional would touch. Their solution? Blackmail Xander Cage with a prison sentence. One he can dodge if he agrees to head to Prague, embed himself inside the anarchist group Anarchy 99, and derail their grand-scale terrorist scheme. You can almost picture the studio brainstorming session that led to XXX. Something along the lines of, Bond is losing steam. The Bourne-style spy hasn't fully landed yet, and audiences want something louder. What if we ditch the tuxedos and martinis and replace them with explosions, extreme sports, and Vin Diesel? Add an exotic European setting, throw in a dangerous villain bent on global chaos, cast a provocatively edgy female lead, and let the mayhem roll. And that's exactly what they did. With a production budget of around $70 million, The film went on to pull in over $270 million worldwide, despite sharply divided reviews. The takeaway? XXX delivers just over 2 hours of loud, glossy, disposable action entertainment. Nothing more, nothing less. The film kicks off with a striking moment. A man in a tuxedo is gunned down by Eastern European criminals and nu metal concert. Though it's never stated outright, the implication is crystal clear. This is a symbolic execution of the old-school secret agent. From that point on, we're dropped into an alternate reality where the world is no longer saved by polished gentleman spies, but by an obnoxious, adrenaline-addicted American daredevil. And yes, I said treated, but that might be overstating it. XXX isn't exactly a cinematic gift. That said, I don't agree with the crowd that labeled it the worst film of its year. The bigger issue is that the director brings very little depth to the material, and Vin Diesel, charisma aside, is not an especially strong actor. In fact, his performance often makes other action stars seem far more nuanced by comparison. What makes this more frustrating is how heavily the movie leans on spy movie nostalgia. If the goal was to move past the classic secret agent formula, why borrow so many iconic elements from it? Familiar one-liners, story beats, and visual nods pop up constantly. Rather than reinventing the genre, the film ends up feeling like a noisy, early 2000s remix of it. Structurally, the story hops from location to location with little grounding, stuffing in set pieces simply because they seem exciting at the time. There's the seductive ally, the megalomaniacal villain with apocalyptic ambitions, and the looming threat of global catastrophe. All ingredients we've seen countless times before. The result is a film that's bombastic and flashy, but hollow. XXX is loud, dumb, and visually aggressive when it really needed sharper writing, humor, and a stronger lead performance. If your only criteria for enjoyment are stunts, explosions, and nonstop noise, this will probably do the trick. Personally, I prefer my action films to come with at least a little substance beneath the spectacle. Vin Diesel undeniably projects a rugged, imposing screen presence, bald, broad-shouldered, and gravel-voiced, with a throwback toughness that recalls old-school tough guys. He's often most effective when playing morally gray characters who stumble into redemption, and his earlier work showed flashes of that potential. Here, though, he's placed in a glossy spy fantasy aimed squarely at a younger, gaming-era audience. XXX may lack originality and depth, but compensates with sheer excess, outrageous stunts, over-the-top action, and a villain straight out of Cold War paranoia. The screenplay shamelessly borrows from spy movie history while tossing in pop culture references for modern flair. Diesel flexes his way through the role of Xander Cage, an outlaw celebrity whose anti-establishment image and death-defying stunts define the film's identity. In the end, XXX isn't a reinvention. It's a noisy spectacle designed to overwhelm rather than engage. Whether that's enough depends entirely on what you're looking for. The film opens by introducing Xander Cage, an extreme sports celebrity who thrives on defiance and spectacle. In one of the movie's most attention-grabbing moments, Cage rigs a luxury car with impact-resistant cameras, planning to stream the chaos online as a political statement against a conservative senator campaigning to outlaw rap music, video games, and youth culture in general. He launches the car off a towering bridge, calmly ejecting himself with a parachute moments before the vehicle erupts in a massive fireball. Naturally, the authorities aren't impressed, and Cage soon finds himself in custody. Enter Augustus Gibbons, a swaggering National Security Agency official who offers Cage a classic ultimatum: rot in prison for life or accept a dangerous undercover mission overseas. Cage is shipped off to Prague and tasked with infiltrating a radical group known as Anarchy 99. The organization is led by Yorgi, a former soldier with a vague anti-establishment ideology, alongside his icy and enigmatic partner Yelena. When they're not throwing underground parties or hosting live performances by aggressive metal bands, Anarchy 99 is busy assembling a high-tech weapon designed to release a lethal chemical agent ominously called Silent Night. Director Rob Cohen makes no attempt at subtlety, instead leaning fully into loud, glossy excess. The result is a high-energy, PG-13 action spectacle stuffed with roaring car chases, over-the-top motorcycle stunts, balletic gunfights, and constant explosions. The movie occasionally sprinkles in anti-drug and anti-smoking messages, though these moral notes feel oddly placed amid the chaos. Watching the film feels less like consuming a carefully crafted story and more like indulging in a greasy, oversized fast food meal. Messy, indulgent, and momentarily satisfying, but hardly nourishing. The plot itself is painfully familiar. Like countless spy thrillers before it, the story revolves around a shadowy organization led by a madman with a convoluted plan to threaten the world. The twist here is that the government sends in a rebellious adrenaline junkie instead of a polished spy. While Cage's extreme sports background does provide some visually impressive action sequences, it adds very little to the actual narrative. The idea that villains trust him simply because they've seen his online videos stretches credibility to the breaking point. The film also borrows the well-worn trope of a government agency recruiting a criminal to do its dirty work, an idea that was already tired long before this movie arrived. Motivation is another weak spot. Yorgi talks vaguely about freedom and chaos, but the film never convincingly explains what he personally gains from killing millions of people, or how he plans to survive his own weapon. The logic simply isn't there. Morally, the movie sends mixed signals. It celebrates youth culture, loud music, and rebellion, yet simultaneously scolds characters for unhealthy habits like smoking. Character development is minimal across the board. Xander remains stubbornly one note, while Yorgi is little more than a cardboard villain with no meaningful backstory. Even the late reveal involving Yelena's true allegiance feels underdeveloped and largely pointless. At over 2 hours, the runtime is slightly bloated, though the pacing rarely drags thanks to the constant barrage of action. The film doesn't pretend to be deep, intelligent, or even particularly logical, a solar-powered submarine being just one of many eyebrow-raising details, but it does deliver spectacle. From motorcycles soaring over explosions to snowboarding chases, shootouts, parasailing stunts, and cars plunging off bridges, the action scenes are undeniably the movie's strongest asset. In the end, the film isn't remarkable, original, or especially smart, but it knows exactly what it wants to be. It's a loud, flashy action ride built for pure entertainment, and while it doesn't leave much of a lasting impression, it does deliver a steady stream of high-octane thrills. At its core, XXX mirrors the structure of a classic James Bond movie, only filtered through early 2000s excess. Xander Cage is handed a gadget expert straight out of the Q playbook, supplying him with over-the-top toys like high-tech binoculars and a heavily armed car that would feel right at home in a Bond garage. On a technical level, the film looks polished enough, and the stunt work and effects are undeniably ambitious. Unfortunately, the soundtrack is an entirely different story. If you already dislike aggressive rock music, this movie will test your patience fast. It cranks the noise to exhausting levels and rarely knows when to stop. The production itself was fairly massive, reportedly shot over a tight schedule and spread across locations like California, Austria, and Prague, with a blockbuster-sized budget backing it. Despite that, the performances rarely rise above passable. Vin Diesel does an acceptable job, but never truly elevates the role. Samuel L. Jackson, as expected, remains engaging and charismatic, often feeling like the most competent actor in the room. Asia Argento, meanwhile, brings visual appeal and functions as a stylish love interest, adding just enough charm to keep things from completely flatlining. As an action movie, XXX is serviceable but shallow. The story barely exists beyond a loose excuse to jump from one stunt to the next. Still, the non-stop action, occasional amusing one-liners, and Argento's screen presence keep it watchable if you switch your brain off completely. It's the kind of movie you endure rather than admire. Sequels were clearly inevitable, and the franchise would continue to milk the same formula with diminishing returns. Samuel L. Jackson, in particular, carries far more weight than anyone else involved. He injects energy and authority into scenes that otherwise feel hollow, and his performance easily overshadows Diesel's. Diesel, however, clearly benefited career-wise. Turning down other big-budget roles to headline this film helped cement his image as a youth market action star. The role fits him perfectly: rebellious, muscular, and marketed straight at a generation raised on extreme sports and anti-authority slogans. Details like the skateboarding is a crime aesthetic make it painfully obvious who the target audience is. The film tries to be both entertaining and absurdly cheesy, often at the same time. Certain sequences, like the infamous boat stunt, feel so ridiculous they border on parody. Diesel was always destined for larger roles involving soldiers, prisons, or both, and XXX feels like a stepping stone toward that future. Maybe someday, he'd even fit into a gritty ensemble war remake. Values change, though. Not that long ago, action movies were expected to have at least a little substance beneath the explosions. Somewhere along the way, that expectation vanished. This movie also raises the question: when did action films become this aggressively loud? The volume alone feels like an assault before the opening credits even finish. Early on, there's a scene that perfectly sums up everything wrong here. A character who is clearly meant to die immediately panics through a crowded nightclub. Instead of blending into the crowd like a rational human being, he climbs onto a stage and turns himself into a perfect target. Naturally, he gets shot. What follows is even more absurd. His body is passed around the crowd like he's crowd surfing, despite the very obvious gunshot wound. It's ridiculous to the point of insult. By that moment, it's clear the film has no interest in logic, tension, or credibility. The action feels staged and artificial. The pacing drags despite constant noise, and the plot barely holds together. Staying awake becomes an effort. The acting is mostly painful, with very few exceptions, and Vin Diesel is not one of them. His screen persona relies entirely on attitude and physique rather than performance. The irony is hard to miss when a movie criticizes violent media for corrupting youth while actively contributing to the same problem. The film's obsession with rebellion, anarchy, and disdain for authority feels less edgy and more forced, as if it's deliberately trying to push young viewers toward rejecting parents, teachers, and any form of structure. Instead of feeling provocative or clever, it comes across as shallow posturing. In the end, XXX isn't bold, groundbreaking, or even particularly fun. It's loud, empty, and exhausting, setting a new low for what big-budget action cinema was willing to get away with at the time. America already has more than enough stories about reckless young criminals, so one has to wonder why this film leans so heavily into glorifying them. What's even harder to ignore is the deeply uncomfortable way women are portrayed throughout. Nearly every female character exists solely to serve male desire, with no resistance, no self-respect, and not a single moment of defiance. There's no pushback, no sense that these women deserve better. They simply accept their assigned roles as background decoration. Ironically, the one woman who isn't openly portrayed as disposable still revolves around money and immediately becomes infatuated with Mark after barely knowing him. Whether or not she technically qualifies as a sex worker misses the point entirely. The message remains the same. Beyond the questionable character dynamics, the technical side doesn't do the film any favors either. The visual effects are crude, the action sequences feel recycled, and creativity is largely absent. Weapons and gadgets are constantly teased, but rarely used in a satisfying way. As someone who actually enjoys over-the-top weaponry in films, I was briefly intrigued when Mark was handed an absurdly large handgun, only for it to be almost completely wasted. The same disappointment applies to the gadgets. Even near the climax, when Mark gains access to a heavily armed car packed with destructive tools, the moment is reduced to the tired trope of randomly pressing buttons instead of delivering anything memorable. Character depth is non-existent. Everyone is a walking stereotype. Mark is the muscle-bound savior with limited vocabulary, an exaggerated accent, and painfully weak one-liners. Asia exists purely to fall for him without justification. The tech geek is there to hand over gadgets and vanish. Eve appears briefly, only to lecture a video game producer about selling out, which raises more questions than it answers. Why would someone fighting for video games reject having one made about him? Wouldn't that be considered a win? This movie is best suited for die-hard fans of Mark or teenagers who don't care much about logic or realism. And yes, to be perfectly clear, I have no love for Mark Vincent, better known as Vin Diesel. The premise follows Xander Cage, a thrill-seeker who has managed to stay ahead of the law until an NSA agent forces him into a deal, infiltrate a Russian criminal organization, or face prison. The idea is that Cage's reckless nature and athleticism make him perfect for a mission traditional spies can't handle. On paper, it sounds promising. In execution, it falls apart. When the film first came out in 2002, it felt exciting. The soundtrack hit hard, the fashion seemed edgy, and the action looked impressive. Samuel L. Jackson brought energy, as expected. Watching it years later is a completely different experience. The style has aged terribly, and Diesel's inability to act is painfully obvious. His delivery of one-liners is awkward at best and embarrassing at worst. Xander Cage, an outlaw and extreme sports star, is forced by the government to endure a series of tests so he can be molded into their next secret operative. The reasoning is that the agency has been compromised, so they need an outsider, someone unpredictable. It's not a particularly deep setup, but it gets the job done. I remember watching this on VHS years ago and was genuinely happy to add it to my Blu-ray collection later on. Despite its flaws, it's an energetic and somewhat underappreciated film. In my opinion, it ranks among Vin Diesel's better roles, even though it rarely gets much love. It's stylish, knowingly cheesy, packed with wild stunts, and supported by a serviceable storyline. I'd even argue it's better than the sequels that followed. On a lighter note, I've always liked the coat Xander wears. It looks ridiculously comfortable, and the use of color bullets was a cool visual touch you don't see often. Randomly enough, this movie even helped kick off my habit of collecting films alphabetically, so it holds a bit of personal nostalgia for me. That said, I don't fully understand why Vin Diesel is often treated as a special kind of movie star. He worked well as the voice of the giant robot in The Iron Giant, but in live-action roles, he rarely convinces me as a leading man. Here, as in several of his other films, he comes off as arrogant and not especially bright, more like a brutish tough guy than a charismatic hero. Even actors like Stallone, at their weakest, usually manage to make their characters believable enough that you buy into what they're doing. This film was clearly intended as a modernized take on the James Bond formula, but it borrows the surface elements without capturing the spirit. There's a global threat and a shadowy organization, yet the villains are thinly sketched and completely forgettable. The gadgets are flashy but overly cartoonish, lacking that wow factor that makes spy tech feel clever or exciting. The international locations exist, but they're pushed so far into the background that you wonder why they've bothered filming abroad at all. And while the stunt sequences are large and elaborate, the direction and editing somehow drain them of the tension and excitement that better filmmakers might have preserved. At times, the movie feels less like XXX and more like XXx. Released in 2002 and directed by Rob Cohen, the film stars Vin Diesel, Asia Argento, Samuel L. Jackson, Eve, and Danny Trejo. Diesel's character famously sports 3 X's tattooed on the back of his neck, a detail that feels more silly than cool when you think about it. He's introduced as a reckless stuntman committing illegal acts until he's caught and approached by Jackson's character, who sports an unexplained facial scar. Diesel is offered a pardon in exchange for completing a dangerous mission. The plot mainly exists to string together one violent set piece after another, something Cohen had already leaned into when directing Diesel in The Fast and the Furious. The production values are polished, but praise doesn't go much further than that. Diesel is once again cast as an implausible action hero who narrowly escapes danger and defeats everyone in his path. Argento's character feels flat despite being written as both a capable fighter and a love interest. Jackson's performance, complete with the exaggerated scar, borders on unintentional comedy. He shows up briefly, but it's unlikely this role did much for her acting career. The excessive action and non-stop violence make this one of the most overblown action films of its time, giving the impression that the studio simply had too much money to spend. In many ways, the movie feels like a study of Bond-style spy adventures mixed with Bourne-like action energy, with a dash of youthful enthusiasm similar to lighter 90s thrillers. There are gadgets, romantic subplots, and international intrigue, but the focus is firmly on action rather than thought-provoking storytelling. It's not a film you watch to think deeply. It's meant to keep your eyes glued to the screen. Xander Cage starts off as a rebellious free spirit, stealing a governor's car and pulling dangerous stunts in the name of freedom. He's forced into government service as an alternative to prison, echoing the reluctant hero trope seen in older action films. The big questions: how long he'll cooperate, whether he'll quit when told, and whether there's a genuine romance or just spy versus spy tension, drive the narrative forward. I finally watched this movie properly a few weeks ago at my fiance's place. It had never really been high on my watch list, but since it was her turn to choose, this was the pick. While it didn't completely change my opinion of action movies, it did prove that even flawed, noisy films like this can still be entertaining in their own loud, chaotic way. Suffice it to say, this movie didn't work for me at all. A film that proudly brands itself with a title like XXX should be far more outrageous than what we actually get. If you're going to lean into that name, then the movie should fully commit bigger risks, wilder action, heavier violence, and yes, content that clearly pushes beyond a PG-13 rating. Instead, this film plays it surprisingly safe. It flirts with the edge of PG-13, but never truly crosses the line, which makes the whole XXX label feel misleading. If you're going to claim the most extreme rating imaginable, you should at least aim closer to something like NC-17. I get that an actual XXX rating would turn it into a hardcore adult film, but honestly, even that might have been more memorable than what we ended up with here. The story itself is barely worth mentioning because it's so forgettable. From what I can recall, the film opens with a James Bond-style agent getting taken out, which somehow convinces Samuel L. Jackson's character that the best replacement is an untrained extreme sports celebrity. Naturally, that celebrity is Vin Diesel, since he's the star. He's sent off to Russia, where the movie briefly feels like it's auditioning to be another Fast and Furious installment, complete with flashy cars and macho posturing. Along the way, there's a love interest, some missile-stopping nonsense, and a supposed super spy car loaded with gadgets. The problem? The film barely uses any of those gadgets. What's the point of introducing a tricked-out spy vehicle if you're not even going to give us a proper chase or let it shine? One or two button presses don't cut it. The movie clearly wants to position itself as an anti-James Bond, but it never manages to pull that off. I honestly wouldn't trust anyone dressed in that ridiculous fur coat Vin Diesel wears to flip burgers, let alone save the world. Diesel is essentially playing the same persona he had in The Fast and the Furious, just swapped from street racing to extreme sports. He works as a muscle car guy. That makes sense. But as a skateboard jumping, adrenaline junkie secret agent? Not so much. Samuel L. Jackson, on the other hand, is entertaining as always, though that's hardly surprising. By the end, my expectations were met in the worst way possible. I didn't care about the characters, the action felt bland, and the movie was completely unmemorable. The lack of nudity or true edge makes the XXX title feel almost like a joke. If they were going to water it down this much, they might as well have gone all the way and made it a G-rated film just for the irony. While the movie did spawn 2 sequels, neither made much of an impact, and this franchise never came close to becoming the phenomenon that Fast and Furious eventually did. At its core, XXX feels like a mashup of the Fast and the Furious, Mission Impossible, and classic James Bond. Vin Diesel is a likable screen presence, but his character Xander Cage is so similar to Dominic Toretto that it's hard to separate the two. The film throws non-stop action and big stunts at the audience, and to be fair, the visuals and cinematography are impressive. It's loud, flashy, and full of energy. Still, the logic is shaky at best, and the emphasis on cars feels more like brand confusion than storytelling. The humor also leans a bit too heavily into comedy, pushing the movie closer to action comedy than the slick action thriller tone you'd expect from a Bond-inspired film. If you're purely in the mood for explosions, noise, and spectacle, this movie will probably do the job. Just don't expect a smart script or anything resembling realism. Sit back, turn your brain off, and you might have a decent time. In the end, XXX is a loud, testosterone-fueled thrill ride that knows exactly what it wants to be, even if that thing isn't particularly deep or clever. The plot is predictable, the dialogue is often painfully corny, and the story stretches believability to its limits. But maybe that's the point. The explosions, villains, stunts, and gadgets are all dialed up to 11, and the film embraces its own ridiculousness. It starts strong, slows down in the middle, and picks up again toward the end, though the first hour is easily the best part. You keep waiting for Vin Diesel to drop some iconic one-liners, but most of them fall flat. Lines like, "I told you smoking would kill you," or the painfully on-the-nose, "If you're going to send someone to save the world, make sure they like it the way it is." There's even a clumsy moral message tucked in there for good measure. Overall, it's not a great movie, but as a mindless action spectacle, it's not entirely without its moments. Overall, the movie works well as pure entertainment. Loud, flashy, and deliberately brain-off fun, but clearly could have benefited from a stronger story. It's surprising that nearly a decade after directing the emotionally grounded Bruce Lee biopic Dragon, director Rob Cohen delivered something as shallow and uninspired as XXX. The film was heavily marketed on release, and with a sequel already planned, it was clearly designed to pull audiences into theaters in large numbers. Judging by its box office success in the US, that strategy worked exactly as intended. While watching, it's obvious the movie was carefully packaged to please crowds. The visuals are slick, the pacing is fast, and the stunts are nonstop. But once you strip away the spectacle, what remains is a thin, overused plot that feels like a rough remix of standard James Bond storyline. Vin Diesel is undeniably convincing as an action lead and shows the kind of screen presence that could easily carry similar roles in the future. Some of the stunts are genuinely impressive, especially the avalanche sequence near the end, which is absolutely thunderous if you're watching with a powerful sound system. That said, an action film still needs a solid script, memorable dialogue, and a story that keeps you invested. Unfortunately, XXX falls short in all three areas. The writing feels lazy, the characters are underdeveloped, and the dialogue rarely lands. Because of this, the movie feels like it misses the mark more often than it hits, making it a case of style overwhelming substance. One thing the film does well is its sense of scale. It moves across multiple international locations, which adds a layer of realism and keeps the visuals fresh. The filmmakers clearly threw everything they had into this project. There's hardly a moment without explosions, stunts, or movement. The villain's over-the-top philosophy about letting the world destroy itself so he can rule the remains perfectly captures how exaggerated the movie's tone really is. Vin Diesel's Xander Cage starts off as a rough, aggressive antihero, but his dynamic with Yelena, played by Asia Argento, softens him slightly. Their chemistry is intense and physical, though the movie doesn't linger too long on romance before jumping back into chaos. This sets the tone early, fast, wild, and constantly moving. From that point on, the film rarely slows down, keeping viewers locked in with nonstop action. Every major cast member commits fully, and no one phones in their performance. At its core, XXX is an action thriller about an extreme sports addict recruited by the government to stop a group of anarchists. The adrenaline is undeniable, and the stunts are bold and outrageous, but the film struggles with depth. Character motivations are basic, the villains feel generic, and the dialogue often drifts into cheesy territory. Vin Diesel did a solid job with what he's given, but Xander Cage remains a one-note hero rather than a complex character. In the end, XXX is enjoyable if you're looking for a loud, unrealistic thrill ride. It doesn't offer emotional weight or smart storytelling, and it certainly isn't groundbreaking. The plot is absurd, the logic is questionable, and the idea of criminals being trusted to save the world is laughable. But if you accept that and just go along for the ride, it can still be fun. It's the kind of movie you don't think about too much. You just watch the explosions and enjoy the chaos. If you're searching for a genuinely great film, this probably isn't it. But if your goal is simple, high-energy entertainment with extreme stunts and flashy action, XXX delivers exactly that. Just don't expect anything deeper than surface-level thrills. What XXX sets out to do is no small task, positioning itself as a rebellious successor to the long-standing James Bond formula. On paper, it wants to flip the script. Asia Argento even mentioned in an interview that she disliked Bond films for their sexism and claimed her character in XXX was written as someone with independence and agency. Ironically, the film itself frequently undercuts that idea. Women are often treated as decorative afterthoughts or visual rewards once deals are done. There's a party sequence where the camera lingers low while Argento dances provocatively, and later scenes include women in a pool being lifted and knocked together like props. One particularly surprising moment, one that's somehow avoided in our rating, features a woman in a skimpy bikini seductively dancing for X, prompting his line about the things I'll do for my country. Subtle feminism, this is not. Vin Diesel, meanwhile, brings exactly what one might expect from him. His performance isn't nuanced, and his gravelly delivery feels more instinctual than crafted. That said, this isn't unusual for action leads, and the bigger obstacle may actually be his off-screen persona, an ultra-serious tough guy image that mirrors his character so closely it becomes hard to separate the two. Still, the film doesn't live or die by dialogue. It survives on spectacle, and on that front, it absolutely delivers. Some stunts are borderline absurd, like a sequence where X launches through the air on a motorcycle, clings to it mid-flight, and fires at enemies. But while they're undeniably ridiculous, they're also undeniably entertaining. Like many action films of its era, XXX embraces stupidity with confidence. It's loud, exaggerated, and completely unconcerned with realism. As a summer blockbuster, it works. The film's desperate attempt to dethrone Bond can feel overwhelming at times, but taken on its own terms, it's still a high-octane, testosterone-driven ride. Anyone expecting realism should probably stay away. Critics like Roger Ebert summed it up well, calling it terrific entertainment, even while acknowledging it would never truly replace Bond. That assessment feels fair. The movie also seems oddly determined to punish Prague. First, the city endured historic flooding, and here it's nearly wiped off the map by a submarine loaded with biological weapons. Residents might reasonably wonder what they did to offend the universe. Jokes aside, XXX positions itself as a spy thriller for a new era. It borrows all the classic genre ingredients: international conspiracies, advanced gadgets, sharp humor, glamorous women with hidden motives, and a hero tasked with saving the world. The twist is that this hero isn't a refined gentleman sipping martinis, but a reckless, anti-authoritarian outsider who'd rather wreck luxury cars than serve king and country. That very recklessness is what lands him the job. Augustus Gibbons recruits X for a dangerous undercover mission inside a shadowy organization operating out of the Czech Republic, selling the idea as a last-chance alternative to prison. For all its devotion to spy movie tradition, the film ends up being a surprisingly enjoyable action romp, provided you're willing to suspend disbelief and not ask too many questions. It's far more entertaining than other spy releases from the same period that tried similar ideas without the same energy. Diesel may struggle with emotional range, particularly in early scenes meant to establish motivation, but he carries a certain charisma that works for this kind of role. His sarcastic one-liners land more often than not, and the film's opening, where he's repeatedly knocked out and wakes up in unfamiliar locations as part of test, sets an amusing tone. The final act goes completely off the rails in terms of plausibility, but strong cinematography and rapid editing keep the adrenaline pumping. Visually, the film is striking, making excellent use of one of Europe's most beautiful cities. Fast, flashy, occasionally witty, and consistently stylish, XXX feels designed as the launch pad for a franchise, and in that sense, it succeeds. I came to it late, having missed it during its original release window, but revisiting it now confirms what it always was. Not a revolution in the spy genre, but a loud, unapologetic, fun piece of action cinema that knows exactly what it is. When this sequel was first announced, it sounded like it could be a wild ride, but honestly, it never really caught my attention. After finally sitting down and watching it, I can say that my lack of excitement wasn't misplaced. The film never quite rises above being just another generic action movie. In fact, it feels extremely familiar, especially if you've seen a handful of spy or espionage films before. Nothing here truly stands out. The main character is portrayed as an extreme thrill seeker who constantly pushes limits and lives for danger. Instead of simply arresting him, government agencies decide it's a better idea to recruit him into a secret training program and send him on a mission to the Czech Republic, as it was known at the time. While that premise sounds entertaining on paper, the execution falls flat. The story drags, the pacing feels uneven, and much of the runtime feels oddly dull for a movie packed with stunts. Every cliché you'd expect shows up: the dangerous mission, the world-threatening weapon, the forced romance, and, of course, endless action sequences. The love interest exists mostly because the genre demands one, and their relationship never feels particularly convincing. Despite all the explosions and daredevil moments, the film never really impressed me. By the time it wrapped up, it felt forgettable, another spy action flick that blends into the crowd. Yes, it spawned sequels, but unsurprisingly, I never felt the urge to check them out. That said, if future filmmakers are hunting for inspiration in the over-the-top, guilty pleasure action category, this movie oddly serves as a solid reference. Even its worst elements are strangely entertaining. When Vin Diesel stepped away from Fast and Furious and reunited with director Rob Cohen, the result was this loud, ridiculous action spectacle. While Fast and Furious eventually found a balance between humor, chaos, and characters worth caring about, this film leans almost entirely on spectacle. The action is plentiful and energetic, but the humor feels accidental rather than intentional. The dialogue is often cringeworthy, though not necessarily in a way that ruins the experience. In fact, many of the cheesy one-liners are so bad they end up being amusing. Do films like this need great dialogue? Probably not. Sometimes all you need is nonsense delivered with confidence. At its core, this movie feels like a cousin to Fast and Furious. Fast vehicles, explosions, exaggerated villains, loud music, and barely coherent storytelling. The supporting cast leans heavily into absurdity, with Samuel L. Jackson delivering a perfectly over-the-top performance and the villain feeling straight out of an action movie template. Realism is clearly not the goal here, and once you accept that, the film works better. No one truly believes someone like this protagonist would ever be recruited as an undercover agent, but that's beside the point. The film's sole purpose is to entertain, and in many ways, it succeeds. Despite its flaws, it's one of the more memorable, mindless action rides of its time. Personally, I enjoyed Vin Diesel's presence and his constant stream of one-liners. Surprisingly, I even found this movie funnier than some full-on comedies released around the same period. The action scenes are so exaggerated that they often become unintentionally hilarious. The snowboard sequence is completely ridiculous, and the early appearance of a flying motorcycle crosses into cartoon territory. If the filmmakers wanted realism, those moments should have been reworked or cut entirely. The banter between Gibbons and the main character was a highlight. Samuel L. Jackson clearly knew what kind of movie he was in and leaned into it perfectly. My biggest complaints come from the soundtrack, which swings wildly between being overpowering and painfully dull. The romantic chemistry also felt weak, and the ending was especially disappointing. After so many outrageous stunts, the final showdown felt surprisingly tame. Simply redirecting a missile and ending the villain via a boat crash felt lazy. A more satisfying, physical confrontation would have made a stronger impression. On a technical level, the stunt work deserves credit. especially considering that many were performed by Vin Diesel himself. He fits the role well, and Asia Argento adds charm as the female lead. Samuel L. Jackson's appearance was a pleasant surprise, and the cameos were enjoyable. The blend of extreme sports and a bioweapon plot was interesting in theory and mostly worked in practice. Overall, it's a decent action ride with moments of fun, but I'll admit it took effort to stay invested. As entertaining as some sequences were, the story and pacing left me feeling underwhelmed. It's not terrible, but it's far from unforgettable. I first watched the third film in theaters, and naturally had already seen the first two installments years ago, but I never really revisited them properly until now. The story follows extreme sports daredevil Xander Cage, who ends up being drafted by the government for a high-risk undercover mission. Overall, I'd say the film is passable, but it falls noticeably short when it comes to story depth and sustained action. In several moments, it clearly tries to channel a James Bond-style vibe. One particular line, where Xander dramatically declares something along the lines of "the things I do for my country," felt especially forced and eye-rolling. The biggest problem here is the plot, if you can call it that. It's bland, underdeveloped, and lacking any real punch. While it's not outright terrible, it feels thin and strangely lifeless, with very little excitement to keep you hooked. What makes things worse is how unclear the story becomes as it goes along. Scenes blur together, motivations are muddy, and it's often difficult to tell exactly what's happening or why. Despite having a runtime of just under 2 hours, the movie feels much longer, largely because the pacing drags badly. It's sluggish in places where it should be sharp and energetic. To be fair, the action isn't a complete loss. There are some impressive stunts scattered throughout, and a few sequences genuinely stand out. The main villain is somewhat memorable, though his overall plan suffers from the same confusion and lack of clarity as the rest of the story. On the plus side, there's plenty of visual appeal, and both Vin Diesel and Samuel L. Jackson make the most of what they're given. In the end, the film lands squarely in just okay territory. The action is too infrequent, the plot is dull and incoherent, and some moments are genuinely disappointing. Still,